Close your eyes and imagine the quiet stillness of a small, rural town. Picture a house, old, sturdy, and nestled beside an endless cornfield. It's the kind of place where time seems to stand still, where silence reigns supreme. But sometimes that silence can hide something far more sinister. Tonight, you're about to hear a true story that unfolded in just such a setting. A tale of dread and mystery, recounted by someone who lived to tell it, but will never forget the terror of that night. The story begins innocently enough. A child staying at their grandparents' home, surrounded by the simplicity of rural life. But what starts as an ordinary evening quickly spirals into something chilling and unexplainable. Something inhuman. Something that watches and waits. The air itself seemed to thicken that night, carrying whispers of an ancient fear, an unspoken warning to stay inside, to stay safe, to not look outside the window. Before we dive deeper into this haunting account, a quick warning. The events you're about to hear are not for the faint of heart. If you have ever felt the cold grip of fear in the dead of night, or if you've ever questioned whether the darkness is truly empty, this story will resonate with you. So subscribe now to Sinister Stories and hit the notification bell. These are tales of real terror, where the line between fact and nightmare blurs. And remember, sometimes the things we cannot see are the things we should fear the most. As the clock struck midnight on this fateful evening, a strange sensation settled over the house. The peaceful night turned heavy with a strange foreboding, and the kind of stillness that makes every creak of wood or rustle of wind seem deafening. It was the calm before a storm unlike any other. Little did the child know that this night would reveal a secret lurking just beyond the shadows, a presence that had been there long before anyone dared to notice. Prepare yourself. What lies ahead is not just a story, it is a glimpse into the unknown. The house stood like a sentinel at the edge of the cornfield, its wooden frame creaking with age and secrets. It wasn't just a house, it was a world unto itself, filled with the smell of old wood, the whispers of long-forgotten memories, and shadows that seemed to linger just a second too long. By day, it was a sanctuary, bathed in sunlight that poured through its lace-curtained windows. But by night, the house transformed. The halls grew darker, the corners more oppressive, and every sound seemed magnified. Surrounding the house was a vast expanse of corn, tall stalks that swayed eerily in the wind, like fingers reaching for the sky. The cornfield wasn't just a part of the landscape, it was alive, rustling and shifting as though something unseen moved through it. It swallowed the moonlight, casting the entire area in a suffocating darkness that even the strongest flashlight couldn't penetrate. Beyond the field, the paved road stretched into oblivion, empty and silent. No cars passed. No people walked. It was the kind of isolation that made every creak, every rustle, every bark of the dogs seem like a harbinger of doom. As the clock struck midnight on this fateful evening, a strange sensation settled over the house. The peaceful night turned heavy with a strange foreboding, and the kind of stillness that makes every creak of wood or rustle of wind seem deafening. It was the calm before a storm unlike any other. Little did the child know that this night would reveal a secret lurking just beyond the shadows, a presence that had been there long before anyone dared to notice. Prepare yourself. What lies ahead is not just a story, it is a glimpse into the unknown. The house stood like a sentinel at the edge of the cornfield, its wooden frame creaking with age and secrets. It wasn't just a house, it was a world unto itself, filled with the smell of old wood, the whispers of long-forgotten memories, and shadows that seemed to linger just a second too long. By day, it was a sanctuary, bathed in sunlight that poured through its lace-curtained windows. But by night, the house transformed. The halls grew darker, the corners more oppressive, and every sound seemed magnified. Surrounding the house was a vast expanse of corn, tall stalks that swayed eerily in the wind, like fingers reaching for the sky. The cornfield wasn't just a part of the landscape, it was alive, rustling and shifting as though something unseen moved through it. It swallowed the moonlight, casting the entire area in a suffocating darkness that even the strongest flashlight couldn't penetrate. Beyond the field, the paved road stretched into oblivion, empty and silent. No cars passed. No people walked. It was the kind of isolation that made every creak, every rustle, every bark of the dogs seem like a harbinger of doom. The road should have been empty. No one rode horses through the town at night. Yet the sound of hooves persisted, steady and chilling. The child crept to the window, heart racing, and pulled back the curtain ever so slightly. The road was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. But the sound continued. Hooves against pavement. Clop, clop, Clop. It didn't make sense. The dog's barking reached a fever pitch, their howls filled with a primal fear that made the child's skin crawl. And then, for a moment, everything stopped. The hooves, the barking, even the wind through the corn, all silenced as if the world itself was holding its breath. The child stood frozen by the window, unable to move, unable to look away from the empty road. The silence stretched, suffocating, until it was broken by a sound that would haunt them forever. A high-pitched, unnatural screech, like metal being torn apart. It came from the direction of the cornfield, piercing and otherworldly. The child stumbled back from the window, their breath coming in shallow gasps. The house felt colder now, the air heavier, as if something had entered it, something that didn't belong. They wanted to scream for their grandparents, but the words caught in their throat. Deep down, they knew no one could help them. Not against this. The stillness of the house was shattered by the escalating chaos outside. The dogs barked with a ferocity that seemed unnatural, their growls mingling with high-pitched yelps, as though they were battling an unseen enemy. Their voices echoed into the night, bouncing off the wooden walls and shaking the fragile calm that had once defined the place. The child sat frozen in bed, ears straining to make sense of what they were hearing. But no amount of logic could explain it. The noises were too strange, too unsettling. Then the footsteps began. Faint at first, like soft pats against the pavement outside. But as the seconds dragged on, they grew louder, sharper, until they were unmistakably the sound of hooves. The rhythm was unnervingly steady, almost deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted to be heard. Clop, clop, clop. The sound seemed to carry through the air unnaturally, louder than it should have been, almost as if it were being amplified by some unseen force. The child's breath quickened, and they crept toward the window again, their bare feet barely making a sound on the creaky wooden floor. Peeking out through the curtain, their heart pounded like a drum in their chest. But the road was empty. Nothing moved, not a person, not a car, not even the wind through the cornfield. And yet, the sound of the hooves persisted, as if some invisible rider was making their way down the road. Then came the screech, a bone-chilling metallic wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't the sound of any horse or animal the child had ever heard before. It was otherworldly, a scream that seemed to vibrate through their bones, clawing at their nerves and setting every hair on their body on edge. The child stumbled back from the window, their chest heaving with panic. They wanted to call for their grandparents, but something stopped them. A deep, primal fear rooted them in place, a voice in their head whispering that they shouldn't make a sound, that whatever was out there was listening, waiting. The dogs outside seemed to sense it too. Their barking turned into whimpers, then silence. The sudden quiet was almost more terrifying than the noise had been. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room dropped. The warm, muggy air of the summer night was replaced with an icy chill that made the child's breath fog up in the dim light. The old wooden walls seemed to groan under the weight of the cold, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and shift, as if they had come alive. A soft creak echoed through the house, followed by another. It was coming from the staircase, the sound of weight pressing down on each old step. The child's heart raced as their mind screamed for them to hide, to run, to do anything but sit there frozen in terror. But they couldn't move. Their body felt paralyzed, as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on them and holding them in place. Each step of the unseen intruder echoed louder than the last, reverberating through the house like a drumbeat of dread. Whatever it was moving closer, one step at a time, deliberate and unhurried. It didn't feel like something trying to sneak or hide. It felt like something that knew it was in control, that the house and everything inside it already belonged to it. Then the footsteps stopped. The house went silent again, but the silence was suffocating, heavy with anticipation. The child felt their eyes drawn to the door, even though every instinct begged them to look away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, just as the tension became unbearable, there was a loud, single knock, a deep, hollow sound that shook the door in its frame. The child squeezed their eyes shut, tears streaming down their face. They clutched the blanket tightly, as if it could somehow protect them from whatever was on the other side of that door. The knock didn't come again. Instead, there was a low, guttural sound, like a growl or a whisper, muffled but undeniably real. It was saying something, but the child couldn't make out the words. And then just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The icy chill lifted, the shadows retreated, and the oppressive silence gave way to the familiar sounds of the house settling. The dogs outside resumed their barking, though it was weaker now, almost subdued. The child sat in the corner of their bed, trembling and unable to sleep, waiting for dawn to bring the safety of light. But as the hours dragged on, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. The hours dragged on, but the night seemed endless, as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. The child sat motionless in bed, clutching the thin blanket like a shield against the unknown. Every creak of the old wooden house sounded like a whisper, every gust of wind through the cornfield like a sinister voice. The dogs outside were barking again, their howls fractured with fear and desperation. Whatever had terrified them earlier hadn't left, it was still out there. Then it came, the unmistakable sound of hooves, this time galloping, echoing down the empty road like a death knell. The child froze, their mind racing with questions they couldn't answer. Why did the sounds grow louder when there was nothing to be seen? What kind of creature made a noise so inhuman, so unnatural, that it sent dogs into a frenzy? Most importantly, why was it here, at this house on this night? Fear gripped the child's chest like a vice. Every instinct screamed to stay under the covers, to wait for the night to end. But curiosity clawed at the edges of their terror, whispering that they had to know what was out there. The rational part of their mind tried to convince them it was all in their head, a trick of the dark, a figment of an overactive imagination. But deep down, they knew the truth. This wasn't just their imagination. Something was waiting in the shadows, and it wasn't going away. The floorboards groaned under their trembling feet as they stood. Their legs felt like lead, heavy with the weight of fear, but they couldn't stay still any longer. The window was only a few steps away, its curtains still slightly parted from earlier. The child hesitated, heart hammering against their ribs, before taking slow, deliberate steps toward it. Each movement felt like a gamble, as if the very act of looking might invite whatever was out there into the house. Reaching the window, the child peered out again. The moonlight was brighter now, casting an eerie glow over the cornfield and the empty road. But it wasn't entirely empty. A shadow moved, quick, fleeting, like a ripple of darkness against the pale light. It darted across the road and disappeared into the cornfield, too fast for the child to make out what it was. The dogs' barking became frenzied, their howls echoing like an alarm. The child's breath caught in their throat as the shadow reappeared, this time closer. It lingered for a moment at the edge of the cornfield, just outside the reach of the moonlight. The child squinted, trying to make out its shape, but it was indistinct, shifting like smoke. And then, two pinpricks of light appeared within the darkness, eyes, glowing faintly, fixed directly on the window. The child stumbled back, their pulse thundering in their ears. Whatever it was, it had seen them. The realization hit like a wave of icy water. They weren't just a witness to this nightmarish presence. They were its target. Their mind raced. Should they wake their grandparents, call for help? But something about the creature's gaze stopped them. It wasn't just looking at them. It was waiting, daring them to act. A thought crept into their mind, unbidden and terrifying. If they left the room, if they opened their mouth to scream, it would come inside. The galloping hooves started again, this time circling the house. The sound was maddening, relentless, growing faster and faster until it seemed to echo from every direction. The dogs' barking faltered, then stopped altogether, leaving only the sound of hooves and the faint, otherworldly screeching that accompanied them. The child pressed their back against the wall, torn between two impossible choices. They could investigate, try to understand what was happening, or they could hide, bury their head under the covers, and pray for the dawn to come. But hiding felt futile. Whatever was out there already knew they were awake. Finally, the child made their decision. Summoning every ounce of courage they had, they moved toward the door. Their hands shook as they gripped the handle, the cold metal biting into their palm. They had to know. They had to see. But as they opened the door, the house seemed to groan in protest, the air growing heavier, colder. The hallway stretched out before them, long and dark, the faint glow of moonlight spilling through a window at the far end. Each step was a battle, their feet dragging against the floor as though the house itself was trying to hold them back. The child reached the top of the staircase and peered down into the darkness below. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty, creaking house and the oppressive silence. Then, from the bottom of the stairs, came the sound of breathing. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly deep, it filled the space like a growl, resonating through the wooden walls. The child froze, heart pounding in their chest, as the breathing grew louder, closer. And then, from the shadows at the base of the stairs, a shape began to emerge. The staircase groaned under the weight of the darkness that seemed to stretch out before the child. Their trembling fingers gripped the railing as they descended each step, heart pounding so loudly that it seemed to echo through the empty house. The breathing at the bottom of the stairs didn't stop. It only grew deeper, more deliberate, as if it were waiting for them. Every fiber of their being screamed to turn back, to run, but their legs carried them forward, as if propelled by something beyond their control, an invisible force that demanded they face whatever lay below. The child reached the last step, their breath hitching as their bare feet touched the icy wooden floor. The room was shrouded in darkness, the faint moonlight from the window doing little to dispel the shadows that seemed to shift and pulse with a life of their own. The breathing was louder now, impossibly close, resonating from a corner of the room where the darkness was so thick it seemed to swallow the light. And then it stepped forward. The figure that emerged from the shadows defied explanation. It wasn't just a person or an animal. It was both and neither. Its outline flickered, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape, its edges dissolving and reforming like smoke caught in a draft. The faint glow of its eyes returned, brighter now, like embers burning with an unnatural heat. They locked onto the child, pinning them in place with a gaze that felt like it could see through flesh and bone, deep into the soul. The sound of hooves returned, but this time it wasn't coming from outside. It was here, in the room, circling them like a predator sizing up its prey. The child's breath came in shallow gasps, their body frozen as the figure moved closer, the rhythmic clop of unseen hooves reverberating through the walls. The creature tilted its head, its movements unnervingly smooth, as if it were studying the child. And then it smiled, or at least it tried to. The grin that spread across its shifting face was too wide, too unnatural, like a puppet's mouth forced open by invisible strings. It didn't speak, but the air seemed to vibrate with a low hum, a sound that wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. It carried no words, but its meaning was clear. You shouldn't be here. The child's legs buckled, and they fell to the floor, the impact jarring them out of their frozen state. Their instincts took over, and they scrambled backward, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the creature. But as they moved, so did it, gliding forward with an eerie grace that defied the laws of nature. The dogs outside began barking again, their voices filled with renewed desperation, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if the house had become an isolated world, cut off from everything else. The child's back hit the wall, and they realized there was nowhere left to go. Then the screech came again, louder this time, more piercing, as if the creature was tearing through reality itself. The child clamped their hands over their ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. Their vision blurred, and for a moment, they thought they saw the walls of the house ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. And then it was gone. The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but an oppressive silence. The child sat motionless, tears streaming down their face, their body shaking with adrenaline and fear. The room was empty now, but the air still felt heavy, charged with a lingering energy that made their skin crawl. The sound of the hooves faded into the distance, retreating down the road until it was nothing more than a faint echo. The barking of the dogs slowed, their voices weary and broken, and the house fell into an uneasy stillness once more. But the child knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing had been, it hadn't left for good. It had simply chosen to retreat, to bide its time. And as they sat there in the darkness, too afraid to move, one thought consumed them: it would come back. The silence in the room was suffocating, as if the house itself had been drained of all life. The child remained frozen against the wall, their chest heaving as they tried to catch their breath. But the air felt wrong, too thick, too cold, carrying an almost metallic tang that clung to the back of their throat. The creature had disappeared, but its presence lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on everything. The child's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any shadow that seemed out of place. The moonlight streaming through the window no longer felt comforting. Instead, it illuminated the emptiness in a way that made the room seem even more alien. And then they noticed it, a faint shimmer in the corner where the creature had first emerged. At first, it looked like a trick of the light, a ripple in the air, like heat rising from pavement on a summer day. But as they stared, the shimmer began to take shape. It wasn't the creature returning, but something else, something worse. The air seemed to split open, revealing a void so dark it felt endless, like staring into the depths of an abyss. And from within that void came a sound, faint whispers, layered upon one another, impossible to decipher yet deeply unsettling. The child wanted to look away, but their body refused to obey. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and with them came visions, images flashing in their mind, too fast to process but each more horrifying than the last. A burning horse galloping through a field, its skeletal frame engulfed in flames. A shadowy figure standing in the cornfield, its glowing eyes fixed on the house. And the most disturbing of all, the child themselves, standing in the very room they were in, but different, older, gaunt, and staring blankly at the void as if they had been consumed by it. The realization hit them like a punch to the chest. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a warning. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by time or space. It had been here before, and it would be here again. The creature's presence wasn't random. It was deliberate, calculated, part of something far larger and far more terrifying than they could comprehend. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by an overwhelming silence. The void in the corner began to collapse, folding in on itself until it disappeared completely. For a brief moment, the child thought it was over. But then the room began to shake. It started as a low vibration, barely noticeable, but it quickly escalated into a full-blown tremor. The walls groaned and the floorboards buckled as the entire house seemed to convulse under an unseen force. The child clung to the wall, their heart racing as they tried to make sense of what was happening. And then they heard it, the galloping hooves, louder than ever, as if the creature was charging straight toward the house. The sound grew deafening, and with it came the screech, a piercing wail that felt like it was tearing through the fabric of reality. The child screamed, their voice lost in the cacophony, as the room was engulfed in darkness. For a moment there was nothing, no sound, no light, no sense of time or space. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The child opened their eyes, their body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The room was still, the air thick with an eerie calm. But something was different. The house felt empty. Not just quiet, but devoid of the warmth and familiarity it once held. It was as if whatever had been there had taken a piece of it with them, leaving behind only a hollow shell. The child stumbled to their feet, their legs weak and unsteady. They wanted to run, to wake their grandparents and tell them everything, but a new fear gripped them. What if the creature wasn't gone? What if it was still watching, waiting for them to let their guard down? And then they saw it. On the floor, near the corner where the void had appeared, was a single hoof print burned into the wood. The edges smoldered faintly, as if it had just been made. The child stared at it, their mind racing with questions they couldn't answer. The hoof print wasn't just a mark, it was a message. A reminder that the creature, whatever it was, wasn't bound by the physical world. It could come and go as it pleased, appearing anywhere at any time. And it wasn't done with them. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, the child felt a flicker of hope. But it was quickly extinguished by a chilling realization. The creature didn't fear the light. It didn't fear anything. And it would return, not out of anger or malice, but because that's what it did. It was a force of nature, a predator in the shadows, and they had become its prey. The morning light crept hesitantly into the house, casting long shadows that seemed to linger in defiance of the sun's warmth. The child sat curled in a corner of their bed, knees drawn to their chest, their gaze fixed on the smoldering hoof print burned into the floor. The faint glow of embers had died out, leaving only the charred outline as a grim reminder of the night's events. The air in the house was heavy, as though the walls themselves were mourning something unseen. When the child's grandmother entered the room, her face was pale, lined with concern. She had heard the dogs barking through the night, but she hadn't dared to come downstairs. The child's trembling voice broke the morning stillness as they recounted everything: the galloping hooves, the shadowy figure, the void that had opened in the corner of the room. At first, the grandmother listened in silence, her expression unreadable. But when the child described the hoof print, her face darkened, and a visible shiver ran through her body. "It's happened before," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air like a ghost. She explained that others in the family had spoken of the same thing, a creature that appeared in the dead of night, haunting the edges of reality. It didn't come often, but when it did, it left a mark, a burned hoof print, a streak of ash, or a faint, otherworldly screech that echoed in the ears long after it was gone. The grandmother hesitated, then told the child something that made their blood run cold. "It doesn't always come for the same reason," she said. "Sometimes it warns. Sometimes it hunts. And sometimes it chooses." The child's heart sank. What did she mean by chooses? But the grandmother refused to elaborate, brushing the question aside with a hurried prayer and an insistence that they not speak of it anymore. "Some things are best left alone," she said, but her tone carried no comfort. The rest of the day passed in an unsettling blur. The child avoided the room where the hoofprint remained, unable to shake the feeling that the creature's presence still lingered. Even outside, the world felt different. The cornfield that once seemed alive and vibrant now felt menacing, its tall stalks swaying with an unnatural rhythm. The dogs, normally energetic and protective, cowered in their kennels, their eyes darting nervously toward the house. As night fell again, the child's anxiety grew unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind felt like a prelude to something worse. They begged to sleep downstairs with their grandparents, but even there, the oppressive weight of the previous night hung in the air. At some point during the night, the child awoke to a sound that froze them in place. It wasn't the galloping hooves or the screech they dreaded, it was the sound of whispers. Faint, layered, and coming from everywhere at once. The child squeezed their eyes shut, willing the sound to stop, but it only grew louder, more insistent. The whispers didn't form words, but their meaning was clear. The creature wasn't gone. It was watching, waiting, and it would return. The next morning, the grandmother made a decision. She called an elder from the village, someone known for dealing with the inexplicable. The man arrived before noon, carrying a bundle of strange herbs and a look of grim determination. He listened to the child's story without interruption, his face darkening with each detail. "You've been marked," he said finally, his voice steady but grave. "It's not just the house it came for, it's you." The elder spent hours performing rituals, burning herbs that filled the house with acrid smoke and muttering incantations in a language the child didn't recognize. He focused on the corner where the void had appeared, circling it with deliberate steps as if trying to seal something away. But when he was finished, he didn't offer reassurance. Instead, he warned the family that while the creature might be deterred for a time, it was not bound by ordinary rules. "It will come again," he said, his voice heavy with certainty. "It always does." The elder left, and with him went the family's fleeting hope. The house felt different now, not safer, but emptier, as though the rituals had drawn out something vital. The grandmother insisted they leave, but the child knew that no distance could truly separate them from what had happened. The creature wasn't tied to the house. It was tied to them. The child never returned to the house after that summer. Years later, as an adult, they would recount the story to close friends, only to see their faces pale with disbelief and unease. Some dismissed it as a vivid nightmare or a fabrication of a child's imagination. But others listened in silence, their expressions betraying an unspoken understanding, as if they too had encountered something that defied explanation. The hoof print remained etched in the floorboards, a scar on the house's history. And though the family eventually moved away, rumors persisted in the village. People spoke of the creature in hushed tones, passing the story down as a cautionary tale. They said it still roamed the roads and fields, its galloping hooves echoing through the night, always searching for its next prey. The child, now grown, could still hear those hooves in their nightmares, pounding relentlessly, a reminder that some things never truly leave. And in the darkest hours of the night, when the wind howled through the trees, they would wake in a cold sweat, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of their bed, its glowing eyes fixed on them once more. Years passed, but the events of that night never truly left the child. Time dulled the edges of the memory, but it didn't erase it. Even as they grew older, moving far from the small town and their grandparents' house, the sense of unease lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The hoofbeats echoed faintly in their dreams, always distant but never absent, a relentless reminder that the creature's presence was not bound to a single place or time. Life moved on, but the fear never truly subsided. In quiet moments, they would catch themselves glancing over their shoulder, half expecting to see glowing eyes watching from the darkness. Streetlights flickering in the night felt too familiar, too much like the faint shimmer that had once revealed the void. Even in the bustling noise of the city, the stillness of that old house and the weight of its silence haunted them. One day, while sorting through old belongings, they stumbled upon a photograph of their grandparents' house. It was faded, the edges curled and yellowed with age, but it still captured the essence of that eerie place. The cornfield stretched endlessly in the background, and the house itself seemed smaller than they remembered, though no less imposing. A chill ran down their spine as they noticed something in the image, a faint shadow near the corner of the house, so subtle it could have been a trick of the light. Or perhaps it wasn't. Determined to understand what had happened all those years ago, they began researching. They combed through old town records, spoken legends, and obscure folklore. The creature seemed to defy categorization. It wasn't a ghost, nor was it an animal or a demon as described in traditional stories. It was something older, something primal. Mentions of it appeared sporadically in local myths, always tied to desolate roads, abandoned fields, and the unexplainable disappearance of those who ventured too close. One account, buried in a dusty archive, stopped them cold. It described a similar creature, seen generations ago by a farmer who lived on the outskirts of the same town. The farmer's description matched theirs almost perfectly: the galloping hooves, the glowing eyes, and the void that seemed to open between worlds. The story ended abruptly, but not before mentioning a chilling detail. The creature didn't just appear randomly. It sought out those who unknowingly crossed its path, marking them as if claiming them for something beyond human comprehension. The realization hit like a thunderclap. They hadn't simply been an observer that night, they had been chosen. The creature's attention wasn't fleeting. It was deliberate, and it wasn't done with them. That night, the dreams returned, but this time they were sharper, more vivid. In the dream, they were back in the old house, standing at the top of the staircase. The void had reappeared, swirling in the corner of the room, darker than they had ever seen. The creature stepped forward again, its eyes burning brighter, its shifting form more defined. It spoke this time, not in words, but in a deep resonance that shook the walls and filled the air with an unholy vibration. The meaning was clear: I am not finished. They awoke drenched in sweat, their heart racing. The air in their apartment felt cold, unnaturally so. And then they heard it, the faintest sound of galloping hooves, far off in the distance, but unmistakable. The city around them was alive with the noise of cars and voices, yet the sound cut through it all, clear and deliberate. Panic set in. They checked every window, locked every door, but the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. The familiar screech followed, faint but growing, a reminder of the night that had started it all. The realization settled in their chest like a stone. There was no escaping it. No matter how far they ran, no matter how much time passed, the creature would always find them. In the days that followed, the hoofbeats would come and go, always at the edge of hearing, always at the edge of sight. Shadows seemed to stretch longer in their presence, and streetlights flickered more often. They began to avoid mirrors and reflective surfaces, fearing what might look back at them. The world around them seemed to twist, subtly but undeniably, as though the creature's influence was seeping into their reality. The final straw came when they received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was faint, distant, and filled with static, but one thing was clear: the sound of hooves clopping steadily in the background. The call ended abruptly, leaving only silence. The child, now an adult, knew what they had to do. They returned to their grandparents' house, long abandoned and overgrown. The cornfield was gone, replaced by wild grass and twisted trees. But the house remained, standing like a forgotten sentinel. Inside, the air was heavy, the walls damp with age and neglect. And there, in the corner of the upstairs room, was the hoof print, still etched into the floor, untouched by time. They sat in the room, waiting. The night deepened, and the shadows thickened. And then it came, the galloping, the screech, the shimmer in the corner. The creature stepped forward, its eyes burning brighter than ever, its form more defined, more menacing. This time, they didn't run. They didn't hide. They stood their ground, meeting the creature's gaze with a mixture of terror and resolve. The whispers filled the air again, but they didn't try to understand them. They simply let them wash over them, accepting that they might never know what the creature wanted, or why it had chosen them. The creature moved closer, the void swirling around it, threatening to engulf everything. And then, just as it reached them, everything went black. They awoke hours later, alone in the house. The hoof print was gone, the air lighter, the shadows retreating. For the first time in years, there was silence. But they knew the truth: it wasn't over. It would never be over. The creature had retreated for now, but it was always watching, always waiting. Somewhere, in the deepest recesses of the night, the galloping hooves would sound again. And they would be ready,